Final Fantasy III released in April 1990 for the NES. Once again, directed by Hironobu Sakaguchi, soundtrack composed by Nobuo Uematsu, and character design done by Yoshitaka Amano. Much like Final Fantasy II, 3 was not released in the West, and looking for an original copy gives you Final Fantasy VI instead. Final Fantasy III's first release in the US would end up being a 3D remake for the Nintendo DS, which was released in November of 2006. Now, of course, I didn't play the 3D remake. Instead, I played the Pixel Remaster on PC with the same modified fonts that I used for both FF1 and 2. At the time of writing this review, the Pixel Remasters just recently released on PS4 and Nintendo Switch with new quality of life features such as turning off encounters or increasing the gil and XP gain. These features have not yet come to PC as of this review, and I will get to why this is important in just a little while. So remember how I said I wouldn't be changing names from here on? Well, I lied. Final Fantasy III is very similar to FF1, which allows you to construct a party of your own with classes and original names. Here in FF3, it's the same thing except you can't pick the classes, only the names. But I promise that FF4 and onward I will not be choosing new names. Now with our party of Plandiss, Gilbo, Treefer, and Gimbus assembled at my Twitch stream, we begin the game proper. Yet again, an intro plays that wasn't present in the original game, and it gives us just as bare bones of context as Final Fantasy I. And also like FF1, we are dropped right into the world. Literally this time. Our funny little characters fumble for a bit before stumbling themselves into a forced encounter. As of now, there isn't anything to say about the battle system other than leveling is back. Also, the MP system of FF1 returns as well, so unfortunately, no MP bar. And lastly, the battle theme of FF3, which as you can probably tell, is pretty good. After our short tutorial encounter, we continue through the cave, where we are immediately taught about secrets. This is the first thing that sets FF3 apart from the rest. Secrets are littered around the world. From hidden items to switches that open up new areas and even completely hidden paths, there are so many secrets to find in every area of the game. Once again, our party moves forward through the cave until we come upon one of the 4 crystals, this one being the Wind Crystal. The crystal speaks to the party and tells us that we are the chosen warriors of light. Our goal? Save the world from darkness, a la FF1. The crystal then bestows upon us the last of its light, and in doing so, we are given the warrior, monk, white mage, black mage, and red mage jobs. Now, you might ask, what the hell is a job? A job is basically a class like FF1's. In fact, the jobs we just got are all the original FF1 classes. The job system is what makes this game truly stand out from 1 and 2. At any point in time, you can change the job of one of the 4 heroes. This means that if you really needed to, you could change everyone into a white mage on the fly for one battle, then quickly change to all black mages for the next. Thus, we get a system that is both less rigid than Final Fantasy I's classes, but more strict than Final Fantasy II's free-for-all. A sort of best of both worlds scenario. As the game progresses, we end up getting more and more jobs, which I will go over in due time. We set out from our tiny village and into the world proper. You'll notice quite quickly that the world is much smaller than both 1 and 2. It's a bit unfortunate, but it makes sense that they had to if they wanted to make room for the intricate job system. Moving into the next town, we notice immediately something's off. Everyone's turned into silhouettes. Talking to these silhouettes, we find Sid. He offers his airship in order to help us solve his silhouettedness and get him home. Taking the airship, we head off towards the first dungeon. You know the drill by now, stereotypical dungeon. Random encounters, random people encounters, etc. In this dungeon, we meet Sarah, the daughter of King Susune, who lives in the nearby castle, which also fell under the Silhouette Curse. She was fine because of her mithril ring, which protected her, and now she is out trying to save everyone with said ring. She temporarily joins our party as a little sidekick who trails behind us, a common thing in this game. These people say they join our party, but the moment a battle hits, they are as long gone as possible. Way to help, guys, jeez. We find the boss of the dungeon, the mysterious Jinn, who is unsealed by the earthquake mentioned in the intro. As a tutorial boss, he is a pushover just as expected, and we get him trapped in the mithril ring. Yippee! For saving his daughter, the king gives us a canoe, a useful item of course. We then head on back to the village and talk with Sid, who takes us up in his airship before smashing it into a wall to open our way to the rest of the world. Guess we are only getting teased with the airship this time. However, the intro isn't actually done yet. Before I roll out my awesome transition to the next chapter, I want to talk a bit about the graphics in this game. Now, it's obvious that the Pixel Remasters do a fantastic job upgrading the sprite work from the original NES titles, but I think they really did a fantastic job with FF3 in particular. From the battle backgrounds to the overworld map, and especially the monster sprites, everything just looks so good. And that's not to forget the soundtrack as well. On a base level, Final Fantasy III has around double the tracks of Final Fantasy I and II. And of course, the reorchestrated tracks in the Pixel Remaster are just sublime. The other games were good too, and definitely had their specific bangers, but the fuller and richer soundtrack present in this game paints a larger picture of a diverse world in comparison to the others. But anyway, let's do that transition thing, yeah? The best way to describe Final Fantasy III is that it is a game full of neat ideas mechanically, story-wise, and more. While it doesn't have the unique and interesting story twists of Final Fantasy II, it does bring its own set of twists and turns throughout the game's runtime. So, what are we waiting for? I've got a lot to talk about, so let's not waste any more time. First up on the list is the introduction of summons. That's right, Final Fantasy III introduced the world to the amazingly cool summons. The first summon we are ever shown is Bahamut, who at the time we have to run away from due to being extremely underleveled. It's a really cool encounter, even if you had no clue that beating him would actually net you his summon. There are a total of 8 summons in FF3, and all of them are pretty useful and cool outside of the Chocobo, who is completely useless. To use summons, you actually need someone to have the summoner job, which unfortunately comes so late in the game that by the time you can actually use them, it's kind of pointless to use them. Speaking of pointless things, let's talk about the mini dungeons, where you are made pointless. To enter one of these, you have to use the mini spell, or the toad spell depending on the dungeon, on all 4 of your party members. When mini/toad, your characters have 0 defense, and their stats are equivalent to level 1s, except when using spells. These dungeons, while a neat concept, end up feeling more like annoyances than fun shakeups. Unless you are willing to change your party into 4 black mages, you aren't dealing any damage. And at that point, why bother fighting enemies at all if you're just gonna eat shit anyway? Just run away and get through the dungeon as quickly as possible. And there's also the fact that you have to use some precious spellcast to actually enter the damn thing at all. The only saving grace is the rarity of these dungeons. There aren't many, so going through the couple that exist doesn't feel that bad. After you go through one of these mini dungeons, you're rewarded with the Enterprise, your first ship, and as per usual, this opens the game at least a little bit. However, unlike FF2, which gives you the ship around the midpoint to explore the whole world, FF3 gives its ship in a similar scenario to FF1. You get an extremely small area to use the ship in, and in reality, it feels more patronizing to use it if anything. At least at first. You get to explore more around the perimeter eventually, but you have to do a dungeon for that. But the perimeter is still small. The world is still small. Or is it? After you complete a dungeon which is literally just a floating tree, which while inside you can't save or escape, the crew is given the Wheel of Time. Giving the Wheel of Time to Sid, he attaches it to the Enterprise, which allows us to go from boat to airship. That's cool enough as is, but it gets better. We ride the airship out of the mainland and suddenly, wow. I lied. The world isn't small, it's huge. The floating continent that we start on is actually the prologue to the game. And even though that prologue lasts about 4 to 5 hours, it makes the experience of leaving said area feel really good. Forcing the player to feel claustrophobic and sad with the small amount of land they have to explore before wowing them with the actual scale of the world is a pretty genius idea. And also one we won't see the last of here, wink wink. And speaking of doing that, the game actually does it twice. The first time when you leave the floating continent, and then again after you acquire the water crystal. The world suddenly becomes unflooded, and then you can really, truly feel the scale of the game. It's huge. The floating continent alone was already a decent portion, but this is good. This is awesome. Now, I do think the overall world design here isn't as superb as FF2's, but it makes up for it with the wow factor at least a little bit. Some areas feel a little underutilized, while others feel overutilized, but the overutilization comes in later. The first stop the party makes after unflooding the world, albeit forcefully, is a trip to Saronia, which has the party getting gunned down from the skies, completely destroying the Enterprise. So, once again, we are losing an airship for the sake of both a surprise twist and also for progression. This forces the party into the Saronian Civil War, which both sides really don't want to do. Turns out, the king is being mind-controlled and forcing everyone to do horrible things. Luckily for us, we have dragoons which can jump, so we quickly stave off the potential civil war and massacre, save the kingdom, and in turn are rewarded with the Nautilus. Something Final Fantasy III does better than both 1 and 2 is a sense of progression throughout the game. Not only is it done via literal landmass, but it's also cleverly done with the airships you acquire. You start with the regular Enterprise, which we turn into an airship, allowing it to traverse both water and air. Then we are given the Nautilus, a wicked fast airship that can also travel underwater? This new and improved airship really makes the progression through the game feel extremely satisfying. To hell with leveling and better abilities, better airships is fucking awesome! And right near the end of the game, you get one even better than the Nautilus. After progressing through a slog of a dungeon, you acquire the Invincible, an absolutely massive airship that changes the player's perspective on the whole world and their travels. With the Invincible, players are now given complete authority over where they want to be, while also being able to rest in a bed and buy potions and other important items. This is a complete game changer in the long term. In the short term, you have this badass warship that can shoot enemies for only the very end of the game. But even still, I heavily enjoy the airship progression that is in this game. It really makes a huge difference because it's something far more tangible than just a couple of numbers going up. And now finally, let's talk about those damn numbers. Specifically, the job ones. Yes, I will finally go over the rest of the jobs. There are a total of 22 jobs in Final Fantasy III. You start the game as the Onion Knight, the most pitiful of pitiful jobs. No damage, no spells, no nothing. Luckily, you aren't using it for long because after the Wind Crystal, we get the FF1 jobs as I went over. These are fairly good except the Red Mage, which by the endgame is completely useless. Being able to use everything means he is not good with anything. After we get the Fire Crystal, we are given the Ranger, Knight, Thief, and Scholar jobs. These are the jobs where things start to get a little unique. The Ranger can only use bows, but has a unique command called Barrage. In fact, after this point, most jobs have unique commands. The Knight is a direct upgrade to the Warrior with the Guard command, which blocks more damage than a simple Defend could. Thief can steal, which is kind of boring, and Scholar can both analyze opponents for free and double the effects of items. Then, after we get the Water Crystal, we get the Geomancer, Dragoon, Viking, Dark Knight, Evoker, Bard, and Black Belt jobs. Geomancers can unleash special terrain type magics for no cost. Dragoons, as I said earlier, can jump. They are cool and fun. Use them. Vikings can provoke much like a tank in an MMO. Dark Knights have Blade Blitz, which is simply an attack that hits all enemies. Evoker can use summons, but in really terrible ways that don't really deal damage. Bards have the Sing ability, which does cool things based on your job level. And finally, Black Belts, which can use Focus, an ability that increases the amount of damage that can be dealt. Then, after we get the Earth Crystal, we get the Devout, the Magus, and the Summoner. The Devout is purely an upgrade to the White Mage, allowing for more spellcasts of higher level spells. The Magus is an upgrade in the same vein as Devout, but for Black Mage. And lastly, the Summoner, which actually can use summons and use them properly. And finally, the hidden jobs of Sage and Ninja. Sage can use white magic, black magic, and summons, making them the most versatile mage in the game. And then of course, the Ninja, the all-around damage-dealing goat who can use any kind of weapon or armor across the game. Whew! So yeah, a lot of jobs and a lot of unique abilities. The last thing I want to touch on is the specific job level system. Job levels basically increase your party members' efficiency at their job. That usually means being able to deal more damage with their specific given spells or weapons. Each job has its own level, and the levels aren't shared between party members. This means, if you want someone to use a job at a proficient level, you will need to grind them up. Luckily, a lot of the big stat stuff is all handled by your actual level rather than your job level, so using new jobs isn't a complete death sentence. Thank God. To get those hidden jobs I mentioned, you have to go through one of the really cool sections of the game, Eureka, a completely optional dungeon that has some really tough enemies and tougher bosses, but your reward is the best weapons in the game as well as the two best jobs, Sage and Ninja. The bosses are genuinely pretty fun, and the reward of it all feels really good. And as an extra note, at the very end of the dungeon are shops that sell the best spells in the game, the best summons, and of course, the best equipment. It is pretty much necessary to go through the dungeon for this loot, but you don't have to. Okay. It took a lot longer than I expected, but now I can finally talk about Final Fantasy III's finale. After we march our way up through the Crystal Tower, we fight Xand, who is the reason any of this story has happened at all. Is that important to know? Not really, because he has zero presence in the game, unlike the Emperor from FF2. We defeat him and are told that it's too late before getting thrust into an unwinnable battle against a foe called the Cloud of Darkness. After dying and then being revived, we are forced into the final dungeon of the game, the World of Darkness. Now, this dungeon isn't very good. It's not bad by any means, but it definitely has problems. To start with, the dungeon lacks a lot of the cool factor that the Chaos Shrine and Pandemonium had in both their art direction and music. Here, the dungeon feels very spacey, but I don't get much more than that. And the music, while a good hype man, ends up feeling very underwhelming compared to the sheer magnitude of Pandemonium's choir. On a positive note, I really enjoy the story significance placed inside this dungeon. At the beginning, you are given 5 different paths to go on. One leads to the boss, who cannot be killed immediately, and the other 4 lead to the Crystals of Dark. It makes the dungeon feel a lot more important because of the added weight of seeing the Warriors of Dark that have been mentioned throughout the game. The only reason I haven't mentioned them is because, like FF1's story, their existence is pretty bare bones at best. And even here in the endgame, where we finally meet them and the crystals, it feels a little lopsided. After we take care of some big boys and get those Warriors of Dark on our side, we finally can go fight the Cloud of Darkness, which, by the way, is the most underwhelming final boss in terms of presence. It is literally a cloud of darkness. You can't make that up. Compared to Garland, who became Chaos, and especially the Emperor, the Cloud of Darkness holds so little weight in terms of story significance and personal investment that it feels extremely hard to care. And that only gets worse when you fight the damn thing. I want to make it clear that as much as I'm talking about things that felt underdeveloped or underutilized, it's all because I think conceptually they are really cool, and I'm sure that in future titles they will take these concepts and run with them. However, that does not mean I can avoid discussing why I think they don't work. So know that my criticism comes from a place of good faith and that even with it, I still really liked the game. Until I found out how fucking dumb the final boss is! The Cloud of Darkness has exactly one move that hits your party with the same damage regardless of your defense stats. One fucking move! This boss is fucking monotonous and signifies one of my largest gripes with both this game and Final Fantasy I. You do one fucking thing and you win nearly every single battle. The game becomes a feedback loop of if low health, heal, but otherwise keep auto battle on because you don't have to fucking think at all. Glad we trust our players to be mindless fucks. I would have been so worried if they reached the final boss and thought they had to think a little bit. Chaos, even while bullshit hard and annoying, had infinitely better design than this fuckface. And you know what's the worst part of this shit heap of a boss? The fact that if you fail and think, I'm running out of potions and elixirs, I should really teleport out and stock up. You fucking can't! You can't! The entire final 2 dungeons must be done in a row without saving at all. And the game does not warn you a single time before forcing you into the final dungeon. So, what do you do when you are underleveled and you can't escape to grab better gear and items? Say it with me, y'all! I have to grind! This series is gonna give me a fucking aneurysm, I swear! Final Fantasy 2 wouldn't make me grind. Final Fantasy 2 is a nice game, unlike this steaming pile of dog shit! Anyway, to beat the boss, you make sure you are level 50, then do the exact same thing every single turn until you win. At the start, you haste your healers so they can Kiraja before you get Kamehameha'd, then Kiraja the party every turn and let your damage dealers go wild. There is no thought. If you lose, it is purely due to luck. F- boss. Fuck this game. Normally, this is the point in the video where I'd give my full thoughts and feelings on the game in a complete manner, and then compare with the other games while giving my reasoning for whatever my opinion is. However, I'm instead going to use this section as a way of giving my thoughts on the NES trilogy as a whole. I think I did a good enough job as to spelling out my thesis for this review anyway. But for those who didn't catch it, Final Fantasy III is a game full of unique ideas, but whether or not it executes them well is a dice roll. And really, that sums up the NES trilogy as a a whole to a degree. Final Fantasy I established the series, but it's far from what I would call a good game, let alone a decent one. With its inherently grindy nature and terrible world design, quest design, and story, it feels like a permanent stain on the series moving forward. Final Fantasy II was a decent game with a story that well and truly carried a title out of potential complacency. The mechanics of the game make grinding less boring, but end up making things a little too loose, which could lead to an imbalanced party setup, making the game harder and frustrating as a result. Final Fantasy III creates the job system, a system that complements the mechanics of the series as well as making gameplay unique and more thought-provoking in the long term. However, in the end, the many ideas the game comes up with end up undercooked with glaring problems in many of its facets. The NES trilogy is a series of games that all struggle to tackle aspects of a fuller game while having one core aspect that each honed in. This ends up making the games feel less like three separate games, but as trials and tribulations of unfinished ideas and designs that ultimately couldn't culminate together to create a successful game. Whether this can be blamed on the admittedly dated and underpowered hardware of the NES, or on the lack of time to create each game, or maybe something else entirely, remains to be seen. However, what can be said is that Final Fantasy III, even though it ultimately failed in many ways, did succeed in one incredibly important way. It made an expansive game, with loads of mechanics and ideas that outclass both Final Fantasy I and II by a long shot. And somehow, it also came out on the NES? I mean, seriously, the SNES was already out by now. They are madmen for putting this game out there on that piece of hardware. And finally, to end this review off, I will start an official Plandiss FF ranking to rank each game in comparison to one another at the end of every review from now on. These are the current rankings, and now here's a word from Postscript Plandiss. So that's the FF-NES trilogy done. These videos have been extremely fun thus far, and I genuinely cannot wait to play through the SNES trilogy. However, as these videos take so much time to make, I would really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the channel, as it means a lot. Next, if you want to watch me play through Final Fantasy IV in the upcoming days and weeks, you can follow me on Twitch, link in the description. And lastly, if you really like this and want to support me, you can chuck me a few bucks on Patreon, link also in the description, alongside Nyx and Hero. See y'all in the next trilogy.